The Bee Gees are one of the most iconic bands in pop music history, and despite their overwhelming success, they were often underestimated by the mainstream media, especially during critical periods of their career. The journey of the group, composed of brothers Barry, Robin, and Maurice Gibb, is fascinating because it involves striking highs and lows, with moments of reinvention that cemented their legacy in global music. In the 1960s, the Bee Gees began their career with a sound heavily influenced by pop rock and ballads, much like the Beatles. They gained initial success in Australia, where they had emigrated from the UK. It was back in the UK that they found international fame with hits like To Love Somebody, Massachusetts, and I Started a Joke. At this stage, the Bee Gees were respected as great songwriters, and their music often touched on emotional and melancholic themes, resonating with young audiences.
I'm going back to Massachusetts.
However, even with this early success, the mainstream media seemed reluctant to grant them the same level of respect and recognition afforded to other artists of the time, like the Beatles or the Rolling Stones. Part of this underestimation may have stemmed from the fact that, unlike their contemporaries, the Bee Gees weren't a pure rock band and didn't fit the rebellious and countercultural trends of the 1960s. The most significant turning point came in the mid-1970s when the Bee Gees embraced disco music, a movement gaining momentum in New York's nightclubs. Their album Main Course, 1975, introduced the group's new sound, heavily influenced by soul and funk, with memorable tracks like Jive Talkin'. But it was with the soundtrack of the film Saturday Night Fever, 1977, that they reached their commercial peak, with global hits like Stayin' Alive, Night Fever, and How Deep Is Your Love. Ironically, this was where the curious phenomenon began, being massive commercially, yet undervalued critically. The explosion of disco brought the Bee Gees immense popularity, but it also sparked a backlash from certain critics and even parts of the audience, who began to distance themselves from disco as it became too mainstream. The media, particularly towards the end of the 1970s, began treating disco music as something shallow and disposable, and the Bee Gees, who had become the most prominent faces of the movement, were swept up in that narrative. Despite breaking sales records and winning numerous awards, the band didn't receive the recognition they deserved for their songwriting and production skills. This becomes evident when considering that, in addition to their own hits, the Bee Gees wrote chart toppers for many other artists, like Islands in the Stream for Kenny Rogers and Dolly Parton, and Emotion for Samantha Sang, showcasing their ability to create hits beyond the disco scene. Critics often didn't keep pace with the Bee Gees' popular success. Part of this can be attributed to the prejudice that existed, and still exists, against pop music, especially genres considered to be more commercially oriented like disco. Rock artists, for example, were often seen as more serious or artistic, while pop artists were treated as fleeting or less creative, and the Bee Gees fell into this trap. Their close association with a musical style that eventually became marginalized contributed to this underestimation. Despite the undeniable complexity of their vocal harmonies and their catchy melodies, the media largely relegated the Bee Gees to the image of icons of a phase of pop music that, after the disco collapse, was seen with a certain disdain. Despite all these challenges, the Bee Gees continued to prove their worth. After the end of the disco era in the early 1980s, the band faced a difficult period, but maintained their relevance in the music scene. They reinvented their sound once again, exploring elements of soft rock and romantic ballads, while also continuing to write for other artists. The longevity of their compositions and their ability to adapt are key factors that explain the Bee Gees' continued global success. Over the years, they sold more than 220 million records, making them one of the most successful bands of all time. As time passed, the perception of the group shifted. Today, they are recognized as pioneers, both in the evolution of pop music and as innovators of disco. Their ability to create hits across different eras and styles, with melodies that transcend generations, also contributed to the group's rediscovery by new audiences, particularly from the 1990s onward. The rediscovery of their artistic value and the nostalgia for the disco era, in particular, helped cement the lasting legacy of the Bee Gees. The Bee Gees were underestimated by the mainstream media for much of their career, mainly due to their association with disco music, which was devalued by critics, and also because of biases toward pop music. However, the band proved resilient, adapting their sound over the decades and creating songs that became true classics. The Gibb brothers' talent as songwriters and innovators cannot be ignored, and their contribution to global music remains immeasurable, showing that even when underestimated, true talent always finds its place in history. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell so you don't miss any new content, and leave a like to help spread the knowledge about music history.
I'm going back to Massachusetts.